Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 69 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, a brief reminder, if I may, about becoming a patron of the Play Podcast. For the price of an ice cream or two at the interval, you can not only help me to continue to make the podcast, but patrons can also hear or read additional content about the plays that we cover, as well as have early access to the Play Review, our sister podcast where Jody Rylett and I share our views of current productions on the London stage. For more information, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. Many thanks, and now on with today's episode. The curtain rises on the living room dining room of an apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Red Hook, which lies by the river under the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. Two longshoremen from the nearby docks are pitching coins against the building next door when Mr. Alfieri, a lawyer in his 50s, enters. Alfieri crosses the stage, removes his hat, runs his fingers through his graying hair, and grinning, begins to tell us a story. It's the story of one of his clients, Eddie Carbone, another longshoreman who lives in this apartment with his wife Beatrice and his 17-year-old niece Catherine, whom Eddie and Beatrice have cared for since she was a child. But Catherine is no longer a child, and her natural desire to pursue her own life as an independent woman will tragically rupture the lives of this family and the close-knit community of Red Hook. This is the setting of Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge, a powerful drama of parental responsibility, repressed sexual passion, betrayal, and vengeance in an immigrant family and community in post-war America. The play followed the huge successes of Miller's first three major plays, All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, and The Crucible, all of which I'm happy to say we've also been able to cover on the podcast. A View from the Bridge was first staged on Broadway in a one-act version in September 1955, but the production was not an unqualified success, and Miller subsequently revised and extended the play to its current two acts. Miller was much happier with this extended version, and it received a positive response when it premiered a year later, in October 1956, at the Comedy Theatre in London's West End under the direction of Peter Brook. The play has, of course, been revived many times since, with star actors drawn to the towering central role of Eddie Carbone, including in the UK, Ken Stott, the late great Michael Gambon, who won acclaim at the National Theatre in 1987, and Mark Strong, who led a strong cast in Ivo van Ho's award-winning interpretation at the Young Vic in 2014. As we record this episode, there's a new production on tour in the UK, starring Jonathan Slinger as Eddie and directed by Holly Race Rowan. The tour started at the Octagon Theatre in Bolton before opening at the Chichester Festival Theatre, where I saw it last week, and it will conclude its tour at the Rose Theatre in Kingston in the first half of November. I'm delighted to be able to have the chance to talk today about this fascinating play with the director, Holly. Welcome, Holly. Thank you for joining me, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be talking to you.
Now, allow me to do a proper introduction. Holly Race Rowan is a director of new work at Headlong Theatre Company, where she was associate artistic director between 2019 and 2021. She was an executive producer on the TV drama anthology Unprecedented, produced by Headlong, BBC4, and Century Films, directing House Party by April DeAngelis and Penny by Charlene James for the series. Previously for Headlong, she directed the Ibsen adaptation Hedda Tesman by Cordelia Lynn, whose play Sea Creatures listeners may remember we featured on the podcast, as well as the UK tour of People, Places, and Things by Duncan Macmillan, another play which I'd love to do on the podcast sometime. Holly has directed shows at the Lyric Hammersmith, the Royal Court, the South Bank Centre, Southwark Playhouse, Theatre 503, and the Vault Festival. So, Holly, my first question is, what attracted you to want to direct this play, A View from the Bridge, and why now?
I'm attracted to the dark underworld of family psychology in this play. And Miller was very obsessed with Freud. And as a director, I'm always thinking in quite psychotherapeutic terms about characters and relationships between characters on stage. And I think there is something in this play that taps into the Oedipus complex that is at the heart of it. And I was really attracted to exploring the dark side of human desire. Also, is a play about migration, and that is so relevant now. And it felt like a really rich intersection between my interest in psychology and my deep political care for migration. Yeah, that's why I'm drawn to it at this particular time.
Those are two great answers because, of course, as we will discover, what goes on in this play is a field day for psychotherapy, I think. And it also has a lot to say about migration, which is, as you say, hugely topical. I wanted to start at the beginning and ask you about the title of the play, which Miller, I believe, referred to simply as his Italian play before he settled on A View from the Bridge. But what do you think the title signifies?
For me, I was really interested in this idea of the bridge being the bridge between our unconscious and our conscious, and what happens when ideas from our unconscious cross over the bridge and start to infect our consciousness. So yeah, that's, I guess, my interpretation of the title, which I've used as a bit of a guiding star throughout directing the play. But I also think I was very struck by what Miller wrote about, I think in his autobiography, this idea of standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, looking down over a community and realizing that kind of Greek tragedy was playing out in that community in the everyday. And he's very interested, as I think we'll talk about it today, bringing Greek tragedy to the common man. And so I think in part it is about Arthur Miller's view into that community. And I think he was interested in this idea of cars passing along the bridge every day and not realizing that these Greek tragedies were sort of playing out below, and the sort of dissonance of that.
Yeah, you're right. I picked up the quote on that. He described the perspective from the bridge as down in a little neighborhood, an ancient tragedy is being worked out. It was a view of our culture, which is up on the bridge, down into their culture. And as we'll discover, of course, he does talk about two different cultures in essence, because it's a story, as you've alluded to, of migration. So characters who've come from Europe, southern Italy to be precise, to America. And so there's something about bridging the gap between these two cultures. And of course, the immigrants trying to cross that bridge, literally across the Atlantic, and we're witness to that process. I had certainly not thought, as you have described, and it's well put, the bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, because that's, of course, very much something that's going on in the character of Eddie, as we'll come to.
Yeah, I think also the relationship between Brooklyn and the rest of New York and what it means to be in a very densely populated migrant community connected by bridges to a sort of more affluent New York community. So yeah, it feels like that theme of duality of cultures is weaved throughout the play.
Yes, the community of Red Hook, which is located at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge, is a very separate, self-contained community of these immigrants who work on the docks. So Manhattan is a whole nother world. I read a lovely reference to it suggesting that it might be a reference to the title of a postcard.
Oh, I haven't heard that one. Tell me.
Yeah, so that it's like as an immigrant family might send back to their family, this is a view from the bridge.
Mm.
It's ironic in that sense, of course, because it's usually a sentimentalized vision on a postcard. And I don't think this is what this is. But, you know, it's a sort of selective glimpse or image of a place, I suppose.
And I guess there's something interesting in staging historical plays, because obviously when this play was first produced, it would have been a modern contemporary play, right? Whereas now it's a 1950s historical play to us. And I think there's something interesting in an audience's relationship with historical plays. That's a kind of bridge as well from us in 2023 to the 1950s. And part of one's work as a director is about how do you help an audience cross that bridge? How do you help a modern audience in 2023 relates to characters from the 1950s, or how do you help a multicultural British audience relate to American, Italian characters in the 1950s?
Exactly. And as you already indicated, there is, of course, issues that are common to our time and that time as well, that we would recognize, I think, in the play. So we talked about this very specific location and community. Do you know why Miller chose to set the play in this particular location and community? What was happening in the world at the time? What was it about this specific area that he was interested in?
So, off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure he saw graffiti that said, "Where is Pete Panto?" scrawled across parts of Red Hook or even on the bridge. And that got him into Red Hook, and he started to follow and try to unravel this mystery of who is Pete Panto and where had he gone and why were people asking for him. And that took him into the heart of the attempt to unionize the longshoreman working community. And my understanding is that he heard a story really early on, spending time in that community, that he described as being so complete and perfect he daren't write it, which was about someone who shopped in family members who were illegal migrants because of a jealousy, sexual jealousy within the family. And so that's my understanding, but you might know more than me.
No, that's exactly right. Of course, he has a general interest in writing about the working class in America, I think, and their experience of the capitalist reality of the American dream, as we've seen in Death of a Salesman in particular, for example. And he actually, you're right, he was intrigued by this story of Pete Panto, who was a dock worker who stood up against the corrupt mafia-connected union leadership. And this was the kernel of the story that ended up in Elia Kazan's film On the Waterfront. They actually worked on a screenplay together in the late 1940s called The Hook, which told that story, which eventually became On the Waterfront. But you're right. He also heard this very specific story about a man who informs on other members of his family out of jealousy. And as you said, he thought that was too perfect a story. But I think there were things that started to happen in the world around him that made him realize that he could expand this story and it would have relevance to the time he was living in, particularly, of course, around immigration, as you suggested. Because in the early 1950s, immigration was a really sensitive political topic in America. And in 1952, the U.S. government passed the new Immigration and Nationality Act, which was designed, as it said, to maintain the status quo in the country, to safeguard it from communism in particular, and undesirables that it deemed as external threats to national security. And it included quotas for nationalities and regions, increased review of potential immigrants, and stepped up deportation. This sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Yeah, depressingly familiar.
So that is part of the background of the world I think this play is set in, because it is about these immigrants who, as I said earlier, come from southern Italy and are desperate to come to America because where they come from, there is nothing. There is no work. They are starving. They're unable to feed their families. They've come to America dreaming of economic riches that they can send back to their families. But in this climate, and with this bill passed, there are quotas, and there are many more who want to come than are legally welcome. So that's the environment that this play is set in, one which, as we've said, I think we recognize.
Yeah, and there's an extraordinary speech by Rodolfo at the top of Act 2 in the play that feels like so of now. It's uncanny. Where Rodolfo speaks to Catherine being the American second generation Italian, and Rodolfo being a Sicilian, having just arrived. So Rodolfo says to Catherine, they're talking about whether Rodolfo is only wanting to marry Catherine for a passport. And he says, "I'm furious. Do you think," you're going to hear it in an English accent now, "do you think I am so desperate? My brother is desperate, not me. You think I would carry on my back the rest of my life a woman I didn't love just to be an American? It's so wonderful. You think we have no tall buildings in Italy, electric lights, no wide streets, no flags, no automobiles. Only work we don't have. I want to be American so I can work. That is the only wonder here, work. How can you insult me, Catherine?" And it goes on. But this idea of the American dream, I feel like Rodolfo punctures in that moment, where he says, look, I'm here because we need money and we're living on the breadline in Sicily. I'm not here because America is so great. And I think that some of that sort of Western superiority in relation to immigrants is so uncannily relevant for today. This idea that people are leaving countries that are rich in culture and extraordinary places, and they're leaving there because they are forced to. And that really made me shiver when I read that speech, because you very rarely see migrant characters in Western fictional stories express status like that. Normally, this kind of assumption that immigrants should be grateful. And actually, I think in that speech, Rodolfo saying, I would happily be in Sicily if it wasn't for the economic situation.
Well, actually, throughout the play, I think there are suggestions about how beautiful Sicily may be, where lemons and oranges grow on the trees and there's sunshine and fish in the sea. But at one point, Marco or Rodolfo, I can't remember which, says the children to eat sunshine, which is succinctly put. You talked about the central story of the man who informed on his own relatives. And when we talked in our episode about The Crucible, we talked about the play being written partly in response to the interrogations front of what was known as the House Committee of Un-American Activities, where famously the director Elia Kazan, among others, was interrogated, and he gave up to the committee the names of people who he said had been members of the Communist Party. So he was informing, in other words, on people he knew and friends. And of course, it's not hard to see those sort of events reflected again in what goes on in this play as well. And in fact, for listeners who don't know the play, Holly, and haven't yet seen your production, I wonder if we could give a brief introduction to the main characters and the briefest synopsis of the plot of the play.
Yeah, of course. So, quick fire synopsis is we follow a family who live in Red Hook in Brooklyn, in New York. We meet them on the eve of the arrival of their Sicilian cousins. And in that kind of beautiful dramatic structure of the, in inverted commas, the strangers arrive, the arrival of these two strangers turn what is otherwise quite a predictable world upside down. And I say predictable because Alfieri, the lawyer character who operates in the play like a Greek chorus, is at pains to tell us that someone like Eddie Carbone, he sleeps, he works, he dies, and it's the cousins that change all that. And I guess that the plot is this hot mess of misplaced sexual passion. We understand very quickly that Eddie Carbone, the lead character, the patriarch, the father of this household, has a possessive relationship with his niece, Catherine. And when Catherine falls for one of the newly arrived Sicilian migrant characters, Rodolfo, his sexual jealousy leads him to shop in the two illegal migrant characters, which in turn leads to a revenge killing by the brother of Rodolfo, Marco, as he gets his revenge on Eddie. So yeah, I think that is the synopsis.
That is the synopsis. I love that you described it as a hot mess.
It is. It really is. And I think what Miller does so cleverly is that if he had made a play about a father's sexual jealousy of his daughter, his relationship with her cousin, I think this play would have never got off the ground. I don't think as a society we are able to look that in the face. I think it would be written off as a kind of incestuous paedophile play, and I don't think we'd be able to sit with the complexity of the emotions of it. And by just nudging it into it being his niece rather than his daughter, and nudging her from being 16 to 18, we are invited as an audience to sit with that hot mess of what it means to be human, with all of our dark, complicated desires, and go on that journey with Eddie. And I don't believe an audience would go on that journey if Catherine was his daughter. I think we would shut it down. We wouldn't be able to face it. And I think he's a master of craft in that way. And I think he understands that an audience needs enough removal to be able to enter into the complexity of it.
That's a brilliant observation. It's only just that he gets away with it, but he does. And you're right, it makes all the difference. Can we talk about the structure of the play? You mentioned the character of Alfieri, who's the lawyer, who acts as the narrator, telling us the story of Eddie Carbone and his family. Why do you think Miller used a narrator in this way?
It's interesting because I think if I was going to get really geeky on it, I would say that she's not actually. Oh, sorry, I keep calling her a she.
Ah, well, wait a minute. Let's make it clear. And you're allowed to get as geeky as you like, because this is the Play podcast where we like to get geeky. Yes, explain why you say she.
We have cast Alfieri as a woman in this version. It's the first time that's happened. Alfieri was written as a man. And the reason being is that I was very interested in bringing to the foreground the feminine emotional intelligence in the play that exists between Catherine and Beatrice, but bringing a third point to that triangle in Alfieri, because I felt like for a 1950s audience, exploring the toxicity of masculinity would have felt very acute and fresh. Whereas in let's call it third wave feminist society, where we have been through the Me Too movement, I think the idea that masculinity is toxic is no longer new to us. And I wanted to complicate Eddie by casting a more vulnerable Eddie and more, for want of a better word, direct, feistier, front-footed, emotionally intelligent women in the play. So all of that adds up to me watching The Sopranos and being very taken by the psychotherapeutic relationship between his therapist and Tony Soprano, and being really interested that in A View from the Bridge, Eddie says more to Alfieri than he does to any other character. So when he speaks to his own family, he often speaks in short sentences. And when he speaks to Alfieri, he often speaks in huge blocks of text and paragraphs. And that really reminds me of a therapeutic relationship. That's a long way of saying Alfieri is a woman, and forgive me if I refer to her as she.
That's fascinating. I want to come back to the role of the narrator in a minute as well, but the specifics of her being her. Firstly, the one point is that Alfieri, as you mentioned, occupies a role almost like the Greek chorus in those traditional terms, who is both involved in the story and comments upon it. So she is involved, as you say. There are scenes between Eddie and Alfieri where Eddie goes to get legal advice, which would be very different because he goes to confide in a man.
Mm.
And some part of you questions what Alfieri's response is to Eddie, how sympathetic he would be. And she clearly isn't, or more clearly isn't going to be by definition. But let's go back to the structural import of this role of Alfieri. What does it bring that he's telling us this story as opposed to our just watching the drama unfold?
Yes, I was going to make my geeky point that I think the more I read it, the more I realised that he isn't a narrator, he is a Greek chorus. And I guess in my mind, the difference between those two things is a narrator tells you the story, whereas a Greek chorus comments on a story. So there are bits of narration in it, but actually, by and large, he or she will be filling you in on a bit of a background. There's a tiny bits of narration where she'll say something like the cousins arrive, which does move the story forwards. But on the whole, she's commenting on the action. And I think the role of the chorus, in my understanding of Greek tragedy, but definitely my understanding of this play, is that he or she is able to ask the questions to the character on stage that are on the audience's lips. So there's this beautiful moment where, in relation to Eddie kissing Rodolfo in this moment of sexual violence, Alfieri says, "Why did you do that, Eddie?" And in that moment, she or he is voicing the very thing we want to know, which is why have you attacked him sexually, as opposed to physically attacking him. I think that's what the role of the chorus is to put the audience inside the play.
Yeah, I mean, it changes the perspective overall completely, I think, in a way, because we also know that there's a kind of finite form to this as a story. It's going to be a moral fable of sorts, a drama with a beginning and end. And I think Miller said at one point that it's extremely direct in the way that Greek dramas work, because they tell the story quickly and they tell us what's at stake. They don't waste time. And he says we could set up what I would call the moral situation. And there were other elements, aren't there, of Greek tragedy in the play, would you say?
Yes, I mean, it's riddled with a thing, but just one more thing on the moral story. What I think is really interesting, and I did end up talking to a professor of tragedy about this because I was so confused. The first time you hear certain parts of Alfieri's speeches, you think that you understand his sense of morality and the moral framework in which he's asking you to view the play. But the more you sit with it, the more you realize that it doesn't make sense. So there's a whole speech about the law is nature, about law's relationship with nature, which even untangling it with a professor of tragedy at Oxford University, we still didn't get to the bottom of it. And the best conclusion was that actually, in a Greek sense, there's something slightly Sphinx-like about Alfieri, where Alfieri on some level speaks in riddles. And those riddles allow an audience to essentially get into the bar and untangle the morality in the play for themselves. And that what I try to do in our production by creating a very vulnerable Eddie is not to leave it too clear cut, that different people will come away feeling different things in relation to just how responsible Eddie is for the tragedy of the play.
Yes, and what we feel about Eddie, which we'll come to. There's so much meat to get into here. And you're right. I'm glad you said that because it isn't clear cut. I've been trying to wrestle with this in the last few days as to what the conclusion is morally. What is Alfieri's take, but what are we supposed to take away? But in some of the other elements of the Greek tragedy, I mean, there's simple things like this is a family feud that ends in bloodshed. And famously, Miller has this view about tragedy of the common man, where he makes the statement that, tragedy is a fit subject for the common man, not just for kings, as it was in Greek theater, and that he wanted to write the tragedy of the common man. He described it as the tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who's ready to lay down his life if need be to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. And that anyone at any level of society this can apply to. And we will see it does for Eddie Carbone. So, yeah, we talk about these bitter family feuds, vendettas. There's also the form of the plot, I think, isn't there, Holly, where it's very concentrated and it's, of course, driven by the flaws in the protagonist. And there's a certain inevitability, I think, about the story. That's partly due, again, I guess, back to the perspective that we are being told a story that we know has an ending. So I guess we feel that sense of inevitability, don't we, the way this unfolds?
Yeah, definitely. And again, from my conversation with this academic, I left with the sort of definition of tragedy, having really drilled into it with her. And where I got to is that what makes something a tragedy, which this play has both these things, is one, the protagonist dies. And two, it is a very, very sad story. And she was saying, for all the academic definitions in the world, that is kind of what it comes down to, is this a sad story? And if in answer to that, A View from the Bridge, it certainly is.
I love that definition. It's so simple. I wish I'd known that when I was at school. I could just say, yeah, it's a sad story. Inevitability. We were talking about inevitability.
Yes, that is it. This idea of a fatal flaw. Apparently, it's a slight misunderstanding. It's been lost in translation. It's actually about the moment a character makes a choice that they cannot go back on. So in A View from the Bridge, that choice is to phone the Immigration Bureau. That at that moment, Eddie sets in course something that he cannot reel back. And that is part of what allows this play to hit a classical definition of tragedy. So on inevitability, from a directing point of view, there's something slightly alarming about a play kicking off with a character coming onto stage and ruining the plot. And you think, surely this isn't going to work. And my job is to make sure people don't wriggle and get bored and stay engaged and there's clarity of story and all the rest of it. And my God, is the story clear if someone comes and tells you it in the first 5 minutes. But what it does is it sets up a tension, a bit like watching something on the edge of a table that is about to fall off, where you know it's going to fall off because you understand science, But the anticipation and horror of having to sit and watch it happen and critically not be able to do anything about it is what makes this play a tense watch. And Alfieri again voices that for us, where he continually throughout the play says, and again, terrible paraphrasing from me, thank God I'm not an actor, but she says, I just had to sit and watch and there was nothing I could do, which is the feeling we have where we want to grab hold of Eddie by the shoulders and just go, just let Catherine go, for God's sake. And we aren't able to do that. And I think that inevitability, if you like, is what gives us the dramatic tension of a tragedy.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. There is a fantastic dramatic unease or tension because we do know that this is all going to go wrong. And as you say, Alfieri signals that to us. She says, Eddie Carbone never expected to have a destiny. Now there was a future. There was a trouble that would not go away. I knew then and there. I could have finished the whole story that afternoon. I could see every step coming. I knew where he was heading for. I knew where he was going to end. And I asked myself, why was I so powerless to stop it? And as you said, just like we are powerless to stop it as we watch it.
I mean, the form of tragedy and Miller's mastery of it is grappling with the very, very core experience of being human, which is that there is an inevitability to our death. We all are born knowing that we all will die, and that part of tragedy allows us, I believe, to process that, and that is all of our fate. We all have a destiny in that sense. We are all putting one foot in front of the other, or step by step, to quote Alfieri, on a track to death. And I think sitting in a room and watching that live with other living people is a very powerful experience in terms of our own processing, of our own understanding of what it means to die.
I also think it means that we cannot escape ourselves, our own character and our own weaknesses and misplaced impulses. Miller talks about our identifying with Eddie, and we'll come to that. Whatever frailties we have, I think we recognize that we may not be able to escape our own character during our lifetime, and it will unfold as it will because that's who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anyone who's done any psychotherapy will know that you spend the first 4 years in it being able to observe your patterns, and then you might spend the rest of your life trying to change those patterns. And I think that really is what it means to be alive, isn't it? That kind of realizing that it's funny when you're directing because the play seeps into your bones. And I had a real moment of going, God, I have to wake up every day as myself. Like that is the one thing that I can't get away from it. And I suddenly realized, I was like, oh, you are deep in this play. You're kind of, the things that are rattling around my mind, or the things that I'm ruminating on, are the themes of the play.
Well, I think it happens to everyone. And clearly, if Eddie could have changed his patterns, it would all be different. One of the things I wanted to think about the structure of the play as well is that there's so many clever, it's not tricks. I was going to use the word tricks, but they're better than that set up this sense of inevitability and the intensity and the pace of it. There are things like the foreshadowing, hints that he drops into the play, which actually, because we are aware of this kind of inevitability, we also pick up. Like there's a story in the beginning that Eddie, or in fact, I think it's Beatrice, tells Catherine about someone else who informs on their own uncle or family to the authorities and what happens to him, that he is ostracized by his own family and the community. So he sets a marker down, a model there of what happens if you act like that. And Eddie says you can quicker get back $1 million that was stole than a word that you gave away. So if you've said the wrong thing, or you just described that moment where you've taken a step which you can't revoke. And of course, that prefigures what happens if he makes that mistake, says the wrong word, and can't take it back. And the other thing I was going to ask you about, Holly, was the time frame, because I think it also contributes to the intensity of this situation. There are references to suggest that events take place over a matter of months, but it doesn't feel like that long, does it?
No, it feels like it takes place within 24 hours. But yeah, I think the timeline that we made for rehearsals, I think we came in at 6 months in the end. But the other thing that is very interesting is that most of it takes place in this living room. And there's a pressure cooker of going, this is a closed space. And though we jump in time, we keep returning to this closed space. And there are moments where he pulls us away from that space. There's a prison scene. There are some scenes on the streets. There's, of course, Alfieri's office. But we keep returning to this family living room where, like, not only is Miller saying tragedy can play out in a working class community rather than amongst kings and queens, but also it can play out in a living room, rather than in a public courtroom or whatever that is.
That's right about the time frame as well. It just feels more accelerated than 6 months, doesn't it? And therefore that contributes to this sense of inevitability and tension and the intensity of it. In literal terms, there's enough time for Catherine and Rodolfo's relationship to develop to the point where they want to get married. And yet, again, it feels so fast because that's what Eddie feels as well, of course. But I was going to pick up on the point that there are no changes of set, really. Yes, as you mentioned, there are scenes in Alfieri's office, but that's basically on the stage to start with. You feel like you're within this contained world the whole time. Therefore, there's no escaping this place and what happens in it. And I had written down the words powder keg, as you said, pressure cooker, that we are just waiting for this thing to blow up, aren't we?
Totally, yeah. And you feel like, as actors and as an audience, you feel like you get on a train and you can't get off until it crashes.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right to say that part of the form of it, or the feeling the form evokes, is so the audience can experience how Eddie feels. And he does feel like he's had the same kind of life every single day, since Catherine came to live with them. And now all of a sudden, his world's been turned upside down.
Yeah. And is railroaded into things happening that he doesn't want happening, or just moving beyond his control, of course. Let's talk about what's at the heart of the play, the question of what Eddie's feelings for Catherine are. As I came out of the interval at the show the other night, I heard someone say, "It took me a while to figure out what the relationship between Eddie and the young girl is." And I thought, that's a statement of the play in a nutshell, isn't it? If you can ever figure out what that relationship is. So you mentioned earlier the fact that Catherine is his niece, but clearly the increasing suggestions that his feelings for her are inappropriate. What are we to make of what he feels for Catherine?
I think what Miller is trying to do, is actually allow an audience to sit with a feeling that is more common than any of us dare admit. So I think if you really were able to be honest, I think one might find that a lot of dads or carers or parents or mums in that audience have experienced similar feelings. And yet it is so taboo that we cannot possibly talk to one another about it. And I think that Catherine has hit puberty and is blossoming into a woman. And Eddie is having to, at what he feels like breakneck speed, transform a relationship between a kind of parent and a child into a relationship between a parent and a woman. And when we were in rehearsals, we were describing it as akin to having sort of intrusive thoughts, that he doesn't want to sexualize Catherine. In fact, I think he's desperate not to, but he can't help but start to see her in this new light. And he's deeply envious of her relationship with Rodolfo, or jealous, and envy kills. We had an incredible speaker come in to talk to us in the first week of rehearsals to talk about sexual dynamics in families. And she does a lot of work in Broadmoor with people who have murdered. And she said that envy kills, that envy is actually one of the most dangerous emotions. Envy kills, not passion.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And what Eddie feels towards Catherine is a possessiveness. She is mine the way this house is mine, which is obviously deeply patriarchal. There's a bit in Time Bends, Miller's autobiography that we talked about earlier, where he talks about having observed the kind of Freudian dynamics at play in his own family. And he also talks about your best art is often the art that makes you feel almost ashamed, that you're kind of exposing a part of yourself that feels extremely vulnerable to expose. And I think he's done something really brave in this play, which goes, we know that in order for society to function properly and in order for us not to do harm to each other, our desire needs to go in these directions. But the truth is that part of what makes us human is this shadow side of ourselves. And if you aren't able to say to a friend, God, I'm having these weird feelings towards my niece and I really need to talk to someone about it, or talk to a counsellor about it so that I can park this stuff appropriately, that thing can get bottled up and explode. So I think it's a kind of invitation to go, being human is a hot mess. And if we are able to talk about that stuff, we can sort of free ourselves from the damage we can wreak unto one another if we don't confront it or acknowledge it.
Miller says somewhere about our identifying with Eddie, and it's hard to sort of take that at face value, but actually what you're suggesting is uncomfortably right, I suppose. It's interesting because it starts off with a not completely explicit distinction between Eddie being an overprotective parent, expressing some reasonable, rational kinds of arguments that we've heard a million times about it'd be better if Catherine, for example, didn't go and take this job before completing her education because he had higher hopes for her that she could do better and get out of Red Hook. And also, of course, there's that sort of protective instinct against, as a man, I know what men are, and I'm worried for my daughter walking the street at night. All that, in some respects, seems reasonable, but we know pretty early on that there's way more to it than that, isn't there? As you say, this exposure of deeper, illicit feelings becomes very uncomfortable to watch. And I was wondering how much that's in the text or how much it's in the performance that you direct as well, how early on what you're trying to show Eddie is feeling. You know, how conscious is he of what he's feeling? Because what happens, I think, is that we start to get clues from other people in the play. His wife, Beatrice, who is not happy with the way he's behaving towards Catherine, and not just because he's preventing her from doing things she wants to do. There's more to that, as we learn. For example, when we learn that they are not sleeping together, they have not had sex for 3 months, alarm bells go off in our heads, don't they?
Yeah, and critically, they haven't been sleeping together 3 months before the cousins arrive, which ties the new sexlessness in their marriage to Catherine's coming of age, rather than tying it directly to a sexual jealousy of Rodolfo. And I think that's the critical clue. And of course, the famous scene at the start of Act 2, when he sexually assaults Catherine and then sexually assaults Rodolfo. And as we spoke about earlier, that being sexual violence rather than physical violence. And then what that reveals about Eddie's desires. And I think in our production, I was really interested in those being unconscious desires rather than conscious desires. I think is up for interpretation.
Well, it seems to me it's a portrait of repression and self-deception at some level, clearly. He, I think somewhere, was it Miller or Miller's biographer said, I think that he's convinced that what is not said does not exist. So when people say anything about it, and people do start to say things more explicitly. Alfieri, for example, when he goes to him for advice, says there is too much love here and you have to let her go. He gets pretty on the nose with it, doesn't he, about the kind of love. And Eddie reacts with an outburst of rage and frustration and denial. We could psychologically say because he's touched a nerve and he's fighting even harder to suppress all of this. I wanted to come to the ways that he does suppress this. One of the ways that leads up to the sexual attack that you talked about is that he tries to argue that Rodolfo is not right, repeatedly saying he's not right, by which he wants to imply, I believe, that he's homosexual.
Yeah.
So why does he do that? What is going on there?
So I think the psychologist that I spoke to in my research for this play also picked up on that word, not right, and how often he uses that phrase. And we were talking a bit about projection, that when you can't handle your inner world, you project your inner world onto other people. So that actually the person who isn't right in the play is actually Eddie. And Eddie knows, you know, on an unconscious and increasingly conscious level, that there is something not right about his feelings towards Catherine, but it would be so agonizing and destructive for him to admit that to himself, that he would rather die. And I think you can read the end as a suicide in some ways, than face up to it. And there's an extraordinary moment in the play that Kirsty Bushell, who plays Beatrice, does ferociously in our production, where she cries out, again paraphrasing here, "You want something else, Eddie, and you can never have her," where she really does speak truth to him in that moment, and he can't hear it then. It's said quite explicitly to him, "You can't marry her, Eddie," I think Alfieri says.
Yeah.
And he cannot hear it. And I think he cannot hear it because I think on some level, 1% of him can hear it. And I think the percent of him that recognizes himself in the accusation is too painful. So he suppresses it by projecting it. And I think he projects this sense of not being right onto Rodolfo. I also think there's obviously a sort of queer lens that you can there's a production that isn't this production. There's just as much there for the taking in the text to really dig into the sort of homoeroticism of the play and Eddie's potential desire of Rodolfo or confusion about how he feels to Rodolfo. He says he's so sweet you could kiss him, which again is also the foreshadowing that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also potentially a unconscious expression of the confusion of a effeminate, beautiful man in a world where he has a very narrow understanding of what masculinity is. I've taken us massively off course here.
No, but that's great. It's rich stuff, isn't it? That's the point. You're right about this projecting. On the surface, he convinces himself that Rodolfo is only expressing interest in Catherine so he can marry her and gain status as a legal citizen. And in one way to justify that that's Rodolfo's strategy is believing that Rodolfo is homosexual, so it doesn't really mean it's love for Catherine. But there's a fundamental contradiction in his stance, isn't there? Because while he's presenting this, he also describes him as the sexual threat to Catherine. This is what he's really responding to, is that he is a sexual threat and rival. But it's also more complicated because it could be a deflection or projection, you say, of his own uncertainty about his feelings for Rodolfo or the definitions of masculinity, as you say. And it all ends up with this extraordinary moment, the cataclysmic moment when he comes home drunk and firstly kisses Catherine on the lips and then Rodolfo. What is happening at that moment where he kisses Catherine, obviously not appropriately, and then Rodolfo? It's shocking, isn't it? Every time you would come to that, there would be a shiver of shock through an audience.
Yeah, I mean, we had a school group in on press night and it was just like open gasping. And I think we are shocked by it because of those taboos that we were talking about. And I think we're also shocked because of that fusion of the unconscious and the conscious, that for the whole play, we're sort of being led to believe that these are unconscious desires, and suddenly it crosses the bridge and he does something very consciously. And I think he thinks, and he says this, doesn't he, that he did it to show her who he really is. So he sexually attacks Rodolfo to prove to Catherine that Rodolfo is gay. But I also think he sexually attacks Rodolfo because on some level, he is grappling with his own desire for Rodolfo. And I think in a sort of drunken horror moment, the thing explodes. We talked a lot about how as people hit puberty, their relationship, physical, tactile relationship in a family shifts. So if you think about a father with a 5-year-old kid on their knee, they might well kiss each other on the lips and be all over each other, and there's no consciousness around that. And that what Eddie's having to deal with is that the physical boundaries of his relationship with Catherine have to shift. And suddenly in that moment of sexual attack, he is crossing that boundary. And he's struggling with the fact that there are new boundaries going in because Catherine is moving from childhood into adulthood.
Which is exactly what Beatrice warns Catherine about and recognizes that, she's no longer girl, she's now woman, and that she shouldn't dress the way she does and behave the way she does around him. And I want to come to the women in a second.
I was just going to say on that scene, actually, very quickly, that it is that scene we really struggled with, and I'm not sure we cracked it because so much of his play, like an arrow, shoots out of the 1950s into 2023 and it hits a target and feels resonant and political and rich and relevant. But that scene feels oddly out of touch with feminism of 2023, in that crudely the bit that you just described actually is the sort of stuff that is leveled at women, in terms of, if you weren't wearing that short skirt, you may not have been sexually assaulted. If you weren't drunk, then it wouldn't have happened. This laying the blame, or some of the blame, with the person who's actually being victimized in the situation. And, we spent a lot of time trying to approach that scene in different ways and go, how can we put these two women on stage talking to each other about the threat of this man without it reinforcing victim blaming narratives?
Well, let's talk about the women. You talked about the emotional intelligence, which your casting of Alfieri brings. And I think there's certainly emotional intelligence on the character of Beatrice. I read that in the extended version of the play, the second version that Miller wrote, that he expanded the women characters, which the play must be much better for that, because we really feel for Beatrice, who's caught up in the pressure cooker of this situation, of Eddie's obsession. How would you describe how she deals with this?
I think she loves him. When I was thinking about what I want an audience to feel, I felt really clear that I wanted the audience's hearts to break at the end of it. And the only way you can break hearts is if you set up real love. So real love between Rodolfo and Catherine, real love between Catherine and Eddie. And it can be inappropriate love, but it's got to be real love. And I think Catherine loves Eddie deeply. I think they've got a codependent, problematic relationship, but I think it is real love. It can be the wrong kind of love, but I think Beatrice and Eddie really deeply love each other. And I think part of the sexlessness of the last 3 months also suggests a sexually fulfilling marriage up until that point. This hint that we've got these two people who've been married together for a very long time and have had a very sexually fulfilling life suggests that they really dig each other.
That's nice to think, because clearly she tries to fight for him, doesn't she? There's an extraordinary scene, isn't there, where she's always trying to make it good. She tries to counsel Catherine, as we said earlier, about how to behave more appropriately now that she's becoming a woman, and to be aware of these things, which Catherine seems naive about. And she's doing that partly because she wants to encourage Catherine to pursue her own independent life, and that's all very well. But it's also partly because she's desperate to reclaim her own husband and actually wants this rival out of the nest in some ways. Is that fair?
I think we feel like Beatrice, like Alfieri, although Alfieri can articulate it intellectually, Beatrice knows it in the bottom of her stomach. If something does not change, this is going to end in disaster. And I think what she wants is for everyone to have an appropriate relationship with each other, and for the family dynamic to be horizontal rather than vertical. So for the parents to have a horizontal relationship with each other, and the children, being Catherine and Rodolfo, to have a horizontal relationship with each other. What is happening between Catherine and Eddie is that they're having a vertical relationship. I'm talking about generations, if you see what I mean. By the intergenerational relationship pushing into an inappropriate one, the family is knocked off balance and they're now heading to disaster. So I don't think she quite, in our interpretation, I don't think she quite wants her out the nest. I think she wants everyone in their appropriate, healthy positions in a family dynamic.
You're right. That's more correct. There's no question she's aware of the potential danger. And when she's counseling Catherine and she says it's time to set out on her own and to say goodbye, Catherine says, all right, if I can. And she says with a great deal of force, honey, you gotta. There's no two ways about this. This has got to change. This can't be allowed to continue, as you say, because she can see where it might end up. And also that urge to repair things, to make things good, to make it normal even. She tries to get Eddie to make peace with Catherine, to move on, I guess, past the place where it's all been wrong, back to somewhere. And she says, what are we going to do? Hate each other? We can't have that. Families don't hate each other. That's not a proper future for us.
And what's incredible about that line is it feels like a direct quote from Anyone's Christmas. That is the complication of being in a family. You know, we can't live without family or equivalent of family, and we can't live with it. And I think there's such a beautiful moment there where she's saying, come on, we could just drop this and just actually like, have a good time. but Eddie is like a dog with something between its teeth and he can't let go. And I think we all can relate to that emotionally, where the climb down is so far that we can't, we're too embarrassed, or I think in Eddie's case, he's ashamed. I think he's deeply, deeply ashamed of what he might feel towards Catherine, and he can't climb down from it, because to climb down from it would be to admit it.
Yes. One of the things I wanted to ask about was, you mentioned the idea that where this ends up may be the equivalent of suicide. And we'll just talk about the specifics of the ending in a minute. But one of the horrible feelings we have as we witness Eddie and this inevitable plot play out is that we can see his actions are so obviously self-destructive. And you just talked about it. He's given a couple of opportunities for out and doesn't take them. And it's hard to watch, isn't it? That element of self-destruction. But it's beautifully observed on Miller's part, because it rings so true and powerful that we can do this to ourselves.
Totally. And I think the craftsmanship of the play is that there are something like 10 junctions where we could turn left, but Eddie turns us right. And they come thick and fast as you build towards the climax. So one of them off the top of my head is the moment where Catherine invites Eddie to the wedding. Beatrice sort of orchestrates that moment. And in the moment, we're kind of led to believe, gosh, this is it. Eddie's going to go to the wedding and it's all going to be okay. And then just before Catherine exits, he says, Catherine, you know you could date other men if you wanted to. And the whole thing unravels again. And then there's that beautiful moment where Rodolfo comes in and apologizes to Eddie. We think, oh, this could be it. Like Rodolfo, who sure as hell does not need to apologize, is being the bigger man in this moment. And I think this idea of Rodolfo as a sort of symbol of the potential of modern masculinity, and to have the grace and emotional intelligence to be accountable for something that he hasn't done in order to not trundle towards this tragic ending. There's this moment where, you know, Eddie again makes a decision to not accept that apology and to go and kill Marco anyway.
That's spot on again, that definition of tragedy you cited earlier, all those choices he makes that you cannot reverse, that he could have gone another path. And we could spend a long time talking about the definitions of masculinity in this play, because, of course, it's largely a male world where they go out to do heavy labor and are the breadwinners. And actually, their identity seems to be also tied up with their personal physical strength. And we have these fantastic scenes where Eddie sets up to teach Rodolfo boxing so he can demonstrate his superior strength. But Marco recognizes that and shows him, actually, I'm stronger, which is another bit of foreshadowing, because when it comes to this final fight, which Eddie walks into, we know and he knows that Marco's the stronger man, because he's already demonstrated that.
And there's a brilliant bit of foreshadowing, which we didn't choose to use in our production because we were interested in using the hook as the murder weapon. But in the text, Eddie peels an apple with a pocket knife in like scene 2. And then, of course, you know, like Chekhov's gun, that's a setup because he brings a knife to the fight. Yeah, I guess just to talk a little bit about the self-destruction that you touched on. And again, this is something that I was trying to get to the bottom of with this brilliant academic. Because of the kind of mafia Sicilian
code of honor.
Yeah, code of honor, which is that you never, ever, ever grass, and that people who rat on their community, that's worse than murder.
It is all tied up with those definitions of justice that go through the play as well. And the Sicilian justice is not as the law writes it. Marco says all the law is not in a book, because what they understand as justice would demand retribution for what Eddie has done to Marco and his family in betraying them. He says he would be dead by now. Alfieri says, of course, only God makes justice, and that the law itself, the paper law, actually can't do anything to Eddie. In fact, he's acting in the law, ironically, by turning them in.
Exactly. The irony of that is exquisite. But yeah, so because Eddie is from that community, Eddie knows this code of honor. And he knows that the moment he makes that phone call, he has broken the code within his community, and that will result in a killing. And if you know that you are going to be killed as a result of breaking that code in your community, then there is an argument that the willful act of doing it is in some senses a suicide. because to use the word of the day, it is inevitable.
So what you're saying is that he knows there's no way out, and he walks into that fight and into his own death, knowing that this is the likely outcome of that fight.
Yeah, again, it's unconscious, but I think unconsciously he knows he's dead the moment he picks up that phone. And that is a kind of willful act of self-destruction. And this extraordinary thing that one's name or one's honour is worth more than one's life is so interlocked with patriarchy. That's not a common need amongst women and non-binary people the way that it is amongst men.
Well, the honor of one's name, of course, is one of those recurring themes in Miller, isn't it? Most particularly in The Crucible, of course, where John Proctor cries out how he wants to be left with his name. And we have the echo in this play of Eddie saying, I want my name. Marco's got my name. I want my respect back, he says to Catherine. All that kind of honor around one's reputation and one's baby. And he knows he's lost it, but he knows it's gone.
And the mind-blowing thing in all of this, of course, is that it's utterly deluded, because the thing that he fights Marco for is the fact that Marco has accused him of ratting or shopping them in to the Immigration Bureau. And of course, Eddie has done that. So the final quarter of the play, Eddie enters into a sort of deluded state where he believes that Marco has his name, when actually Marco calling him a rat or an animal is the truth.
Yeah, and so there's a complete contradiction, which supports the idea that he's walking voluntarily to this suicide, perhaps, is that because he knows he's done it, he knows that Marco is never going to withdraw his accusation.
Yeah.
And he taunts him, says, Marco, you're a liar. He's poking the snake and walking into it. Can I ask you for about the end? How do we feel about Eddie in the end? Miller wrote, he thought that the play could move people with pity for the protagonist. Mm-hmm. And even identification with him, a man who does so many unworthy things. And it was finally possible, he said at some point, to mourn him. And that's a word that Alfieri uses in his final speech, that he mourns him. Something perversely pure calls to me from his memory, not purely good, but himself purely, for he allowed himself to be purely known, and for that I will love him more than all my sensible clients. And yet it is better to settle for half, it must be. And so I mourn him with a certain alarm. What is he feeling about Eddie, that he's giving him credit for living purely, and also that he's mourning him, but what also is his certain alarm?
Yeah, so this, I think, is the riddle of the Sphinx, that I confess that something perversely pure calls to me from his memory, not purely good, but himself pity, for he allowed himself to be wholly known. And my best stab at this, worked out with a number of different people, is that Eddie allows himself to be wholly known to the audience, that we see Eddie in his pure, messy, complicated human state. Eddie himself does not see himself. Part of the agony of this play is that Eddie will never allow himself to be wholly known to himself. So I think this is a riddle. I don't think Alfieri is serving up at the end this play with a neat bow round it. I think what Alfieri is doing is saying to expose yourself by following your unconscious drive, that there's something sort of remarkable in that, because most of us wouldn't dare to do that. But simultaneously, a part of the agony of it is that Eddie can't see for himself that that's what he's doing, and that is the certain alarm. But there is something alarming and frightening about someone acting on impulse without the self-awareness that they are acting on impulse.
And without constraint. I mean, he may admire the fullness of his energy or passion, but he basically says it's better to settle for half in the end, because we can't have a civilized society unless we restrain some of these instincts and behavior, clearly. So he also understands that. And I think we also feel the sadness that you mentioned was necessary too, because it was surprising, again, when I read the text, how often Eddie is crying. He is deeply unhappy about what's happened to him and what he's doing. And therefore, we do have some empathy ultimately, despite our horror at some of what he is doing. But I think what Alfieri is doing is admitting, he says, I admit with a certain alarm. Is it the alarm that we're all capable of these powerful desires and this potentially transgressive behavior?
Yeah, and I think interestingly, that's where the gender politics of it come in for me, because I think Alfieri in a woman's voice saying alarm at Eddie's violence and passion is different from a man feeling alarm at Eddie's violence and passion. And you could argue that in a patriarchal society where we've all been socialized into certain gender norms, a man might see another man's violent outburst and be scared that he himself has the capacity for that violent outburst. Whereas a woman might see a man's violent outburst and on some level know that to settle for half is the better thing, even though sometimes as a woman you might want to kill someone or tear someone's limbs off as much as the next man.
Well, it's certainly got to be better for women. It's interesting you say that about Alfieri as a man identifying in himself that potential. Yes, I think it's, are we so different, perhaps, in the end? Thank you, Holly. That's been fantastic. Before I let you go, I'm afraid, there is one thing I want to ask you, which is one of the features of the podcast. I'd like to ask my guest to nominate another play that we might cover in the podcast, or one that's just a personal favorite. I know it's iniquitous to ask a director to choose one play, but is there a play that you would recommend?
I think the play that haunts me with a certain alarm is Frederick Dürrenmatt's The Visit. I don't have a particular favourite translation of it, but every time I come back to that story, which is about morality and community and capitalism, I'm left rattled. But I also think it's just a very tasty piece of work.
It's a great suggestion. Thank you. I would love to discover it. And I think it's totally appropriate that it haunts you with alarm. And as you said earlier, I think, isn't that the purpose of art, is to rattle us?
Mm.
Thank you, Holly, for having this fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Holly's production of A View from the Bridge is playing at the Chichester Festival Theatre until the 28th of October, and then at the Rose Theatre in Kingston from the 31st of October to the 11th of November. Don't miss it. As the curtain falls on the lifeless body of Eddie Carbone and the carnage he has caused, how do we judge him? He had a fierce but misplaced idea of honor, a truth inside himself he could not deny. But honor is truly found in your responsibilities to others, your family, your community. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.